How's everybody doing? Good? Everybody seen some good stuff this week? Yeah? It's my first time at this conference, so definitely getting a chance to enjoy it a little bit. So my name's Frethem. I'm a senior engineer with Varonis. A little bit of my background. So I'm not really an IAM guy. So this has been a new kind of eye-opening thing for me. Currently I'm a data governance expert. And in the past, my background was being a server jockey and working with things like Active Directory and remote access. So I'm coming at this from a little bit different perspective. So I'm hoping that I can share some of my input in terms of what we need to look at in terms of data. During this week, in a lot of the other presentations, I've heard a lot of words brought up that have to do with data governance. I've heard GDPR talked about a lot. If you were in Ralph's session just before this, it was a big topic of conversation. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to try something a little bit different than the way I normally do one of these types of presentations. And that is, I want to start from the beginning and say, or excuse me, from the end, from the prestige, right, the final product. I want to be able to present, the Data Utopia, the place that we want to end and get to, because I think that's going to make more sense to folks who have to worry about governing identity and access to things. But I'm going to work backwards from there and say, but these are the things you got to do first. And what I see is a big part of the reason why a lot of data cleanup projects, data governance projects end up failing. So let's start with this. This would be what I describe as a data utopia. And that's very simply knowing where all the sensitive data exists on our network, right? We want to know what the most sensitive assets are, the things that we need to protect. We need to make sure that only the correct people have access to it. And we need to make sure that we know when something goes wrong. So in general, if someone is accessing a piece of information that they should not have access to, we need to make sure that we're notified about that, that we have a response plan in place, that we know what to do about it. Now, probably even more important is that this is a sustainable thing, that we can repeat this process over and over and over again. Is there anyone in the room that does not expect their data sets to grow over the coming years? Because usually I say, is anyone who thinks their data is going to grow, and everyone raises their hand? Well, I stopped doing that because everyone raised their hand. So is anyone going to have it shrink going forward? It'd be the first time if that actually happened to me. So, but this problem can be very difficult to solve because data sets are growing, and also because in general, there's already a lot of data out there, and we're just increasing the amount of platforms where this data exists. I liked in the last presentation, he talked about, we have these governed systems, we have these databases with customer information. And then somebody takes this information out and manipulates this data to put it into an Excel document so they can create some pretty graphs. And then they put it in PowerPoint, and then they save it as a PDF. And all of a sudden, you have information saved out to the file system. You've got it in SharePoint. We've got cloud systems now, so somebody's putting it in Google Drive or Office 365 or SharePoint Online. And all of a sudden, this problem just becomes so big and so exacerbated, it's hard to know what to do with it. So let's start from this ideal state. Let's start from what we'd be talking about in terms of what it would look like from the end, okay? And so, I guess I skipped a slide here. Here's some supporting information about this. So we do these assessments for organizations that are trying to see what's going on with their data. And you see statistics out there. This is from hundreds of customers that we did in 2017. And we see information like, it did auto-advance on me, sorry. We see 41% of organizations had at least 1,000 files, sensitive files, open to every single person in the organization, right? That is obviously a big issue. We're talking about a situation where someone's credit card information might be sitting out there that anyone can touch at any time. In general, we have over 100 organizations, 58% of organizations have 100,000 or more sensitive folders that are open to every single employee. This comes from global access groups. Like our domain users or everyone groups, that is causing this problem to happen. We're seeing organizations with over 75% of their data is stale. It's not being used anymore. No one's touching it, therefore introducing risk because it's sitting out there in the file share and no one knows what to do with it anymore, right? So as I was saying earlier, this is what I would talk about. So if we were starting from the very end, what would we be doing with data? So we would have all that stuff defined that we talked about before, and we would be automating our authorization workflows, automating our entitlement reviews. Now, what's important to note here is a couple of things. We're talking about role-based access, and I'm sure in this room there's no lack of familiarity with this. But this becomes very, very important in the sense of how access to data or files in the file system was done in the past. And it was, hey, Jill from accounting is starting. Let's just make Jill look just like Bob in accounting, and that's how we're going to do it, right? And that's how we've always done in the past. But the problem is what if Bob has access to, say, SOX-compliant information about the company being public, and he's supposed to have access, but Jill is not? All of a sudden, we've introduced that risk where if Jill's account gets compromised, that becomes an issue because she has access to things that she shouldn't. The next piece is, and I heard Ralph talk about this a lot before, is data ownership and how critical this is in terms of governing this access. IT is not going to know the difference between Bob and Jill in terms of accounting. Not going to know who needs access to what. We have to get someone from the business to be able to give us this information, be able to tell us that Jill should be different than Bob. Of course, we need abilities to remove this access when it's no longer required. If Jill leaves accounting and goes over to HR, you know, from an IT perspective, when that happens, we always remove their old access, right? Yes? Yep, always. It pretty rarely happens. That's something we need to make sure that we can do. And we need to make sure that owners are actually reviewing that access on a regular basis. So that, you know, if an owner sees that Jill did leave, did go to HR, that access has changed. Ideally, this is all automated. You know, that's the utopia. That's where we want to get. But there's a lot of things that need to be done first with these types of things. And so I'm going to walk through some of these steps that we have. So first and foremost, in order to do a lot of this stuff, we need activity monitoring on data. And that whatever platform it has right there. We need to make sure that we know when users are opening files or not opening files, so we can tell which of those files are stale or no longer in use. We need to do this in order to know which permissions are in use. In order to be able to do some analysis to say, okay, if a permission has 50 people in it and only 20 of those people are in there, how do we know to remove those other 30? We need to be able to catch deviations from these standards. So if we say, for example, that credit card data can only exist in one area of our network, you know, if we have PCI compliant data and we say, okay, here's our PCI bubble, and if the data moves out of it, we need to know and probably be able to automatically pick it up and move it back. That's another pretty critical thing. Same thing with stale data. Once we define things like our policies and say, once financial information is 3 years old, it is off the system, we're going to purge it. Being able to do that in an automated fashion, you know, gives us a big step forward. I already talked a little bit about, you know, those authorization workflows and entitlement and revocation of access. That's different pieces we need to do. But in terms of a data access and data governance project, there are more things that we need to do to get to this point. And I see a lot of organizations sink a lot of hours, a lot of time with consulting organizations to try to get there, but they skip over these steps or they struggle to complete these steps. And that would be actually going through and fixing those permissions that are out there. Those global groups should not be on your network. And as I said before, despite the fact that a lot of people have tried this type of thing, still almost 60% had 100,000 folders or more open to global access. So this is something that just absolutely has to be cleaned up. As a precursor to that, another thing that we see in the file system that's a big issue is broken inheritance or broken permissions in the directory structure. So if you have a folder that's sitting 5 levels deep, and because of a restore, or because it's machine generated, application generated, something is putting this folder out there, that inheritance gets broken, right? This is something that, you know, is an issue risk with the Microsoft file system, for example. But the problem is if you go through and fix your permissions on a top level, it doesn't help if 5 levels down, it doesn't apply. So that's something that you have to do first. Broken inheritance needs to be cleaned up. Global groups need to be cleaned up. You've got to be able to simplify your permission structure, go more along with the recommended standards of nobody should have full control except for administrators, right? Modify access, not full control. And 2 types, modify, read, write. Those are the only 2 types of access we should be giving out, okay? And then also, like as I mentioned before, identifying those data owners, making sure that they're doing those entitlement reviews. We're going to have to do this, there's a lot of work initially up front, right? We're going to be expecting a lot from IT, we're going to be expecting a lot from the business to be able to come and do this. But once we get through these steps, we can get a little bit further along. A few more things that need to be done before this, and I'll talk about why these are important. mapping the actual permissions and file system. So it's easy enough to go out and right-click a folder and see who has access to it, right? That's a pretty simple thing to do. But what's a little bit more difficult to understand with the existing tools and platforms that are out there today is understanding from a user perspective what they have access to. So you need to get something that maps those permission structures. So I know if Jill from accounting, when I give her access to a group, where that gives her access to, not just in the file system, but in a SharePoint environment, in an Office 365 environment, in a cloud environment. We need to know across all of our data sets because those things are growing. Obviously, we need to go through a data sensitivity and discovery project, understanding where the sensitive information is. The next presentation up after this is one of our customers who's gone through this process, so we'll talk about that in a little bit if you want to hang around and see that right after. Auditing all the activity, which I talked about before, this can be very helpful in terms of identifying those owners, because if we know who's using data sets, if we know that level of activity, I can say, hey, this person's the most active user. They might know who that, or they might not be the data owner, but they can probably tell us who is, right? So we can assign it from there. And another big thing in terms of catching breaches, catching issues with data, unusual data activity, is actually baselining that behavior. So knowing that Bob from accounting accesses the same 2 spreadsheets every single day. He works in and out of that every day. All of a sudden, Bob grabs 150 files and they're sensitive, right? I want to know when that happens. I want to be able to alert on something like that and potentially be able to step in and stop it. And all of this is basically going through an assessment so you can prioritize where your risks are and know what to hit first. So we can combine information such as where data is active, where it's sensitive, and where it's overexposed, like a global group. Combine those 3 things together, and then all of a sudden your hundreds and hundreds of terabytes where you're starting with, we're narrowing our focus down, usually typically to less than 5% of the data that actually needs to be protected, right? So we start there. Make our projects, make our lives a lot easier. So for us, for Varonis, what we've done is we've set this out into an operational journey, and where we put this in a step-by-step process where in order to get to phase 5, 6, right, which is where most people, when they think about a data governance project, that's what they're thinking about. We're thinking about step 5, but we're not doing all the things that we need to do before that to get to there. So that's what we've done, is we've put this out there, and this is publicly available, of saying these are the steps and these are the things that you need to do in order to have a successful data governance project, where in order to have that utopia where you're cleaning up access, where you're automating those entitlement reviews, these are the things that need to be done first. The cleanup of the permissions, the prioritizing risk, and all of that. And if I could leave you with one thing from today, and that is go and get an assessment of where you are today. I think this is just one of the most critical pieces and something that I recommend. Even if you've gone through one of these projects before, it's always good to do this. You know, this is something that we recommend doing on a regular basis with all of our customers. So if you have been thinking about this, if this is something that's important to you, I encourage you to go out and look into this. Now, I've flown through this presentation about 15 minutes, so I've got 5-10 minutes left if you have some questions about or any sort of the customers that I've worked with. Again, I would encourage you to come see the next session as well, because he'll actually be walking through, he's from one of our customers, and he's actually going to be walking through how they did a data cleanup project, so there'll be some good information in there. But if you have any questions for me or anything I can talk about, or any questions, we have a good couple of minutes left, so. Or we can all take a nap. What's up? Sure. Yeah, so his question was, how do you narrow down the focus of data? And the 3 things that we recommend are, first, of where the data is most active, right? So data that has activity, people are aware that it's there and know that it's there. The second piece is sensitivity, right? Does it contain credit card information? Is it GDPR information? Is it HIPAA-related data? And the third piece is where it's overexposed. So in general, what we'd like to focus on is global access groups, because that's a group that gives everyone in the company access to that folder. So those 3 things, that's what we use to triangulate what is our biggest exposure, and that's where we want to start. Yeah. Go ahead. Sure. Yep. Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. Sure. I mean, so the difficulty with that is, I mean, as I mentioned in the beginning, there's a lot of different platforms, and so how we would do it, and I'm focusing more on the the unstructured data stores, just because that's where my organization typically focuses. I mean, how we're going to do that is by auditing the activity, monitoring the activity. Now, if you're talking about an internally managed system, something that's closed off. That's something where, unfortunately what we have to do is work with those application developers or those application companies to help us tell us which data is in use and not. It's easy for me to do that in outside environments. There's a lot of different tools and platforms you can use to monitor activity on things like file shares, mass storage, SharePoint, those types of things. Where it gets more dicey is the applications, right? Where you don't necessarily have that visibility either because it's a platform that doesn't have a monitoring system or just the application company doesn't want you to do that. So I wish I had a better answer for you on that one. How I would tell what's used and what's not is by monitoring that activity, but not every platform is going to have that. Does that answer your question? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Yep. Right. Right. Yeah. I'm afraid, unfortunately, I don't, my organization doesn't interface with Oracle, in terms of their applications. So, again, I don't have a good answer for you. But, I mean, like I said, to me, it'd be the same two things, is knowing, if we have an activity trail, do that, and then also get involved with someone from the business. Get involved, if it's a sales organization, get involvement from the sales folks, and have asked and say, hey, we see someone not using this particular report, can we get rid of it? Because ultimately, in any one of these scenarios, they're the ones who are going to have the answer. So, I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you. Yeah. How do you automate it? So what we would do is we would look at automating those reports to the business lines in a situation where it says, here's our top offended data, right? So combine those same sort of information before sensitivity not being used, and say, do you want to remove that? I wish I could tell you there is a hard and fast rule in terms of how to set that. We do have inside the Varonis platform, there's some automated ability to say if something's 2 years older or more and it contains a credit card, that we can delete it off the file system. So we have some abilities to automate that on the standard file systems, not so much in the Oracle system. Yeah. But I mean, ultimately, I think it's defining policies, right? So we would need as an organization with the business to define, say, okay, if it contains financial information and it reaches the 2-year threshold, anything beyond that is going to be removed, and you try to automate that if you can. That's what we work with organizations to do. So, go ahead.
So in terms of what kind of tax do you guys use when you're dealing with an organization that does data hoarding, right?
Mm-hmm.
It may not have been accessed in, say, the last 5 years, but we might need it later. Right?
Yeah.
What's the typical approach, or what do you find that's important?
One of my favorite things to do would be to remove it, restrict it, maybe move it to a lesser expensive data set share, or just lock down the rights to it and leave a note behind saying, hey, this data was archived because it exceeded our policy. Oh, look at that. Because it exceeded our policy, and leave the note behind saying, contact this person. Because it's amazing to me sometimes people say, oh, no, we can't get rid of that data, and then you archive it and you move it and it sits there for a year and a half and no one's complained. You know, that's probably a less elegant way to do it. In general, it's got to be a decision made with the business, and you know, a lot of times what we'll try to do is go higher up in the organization, because I mean, these types of projects do have C-level backing typically, and so if you can get the board to get behind it and say, look, we have to clean up this risk, you know, they'll do it. Yeah. Good question. All right. I'm going to give everybody a little bit of a break before the next one. Thanks a lot.